What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video. Today we're going to be going over the Warden tank. So not much has changed for Warden tanks or tanks in general between Dragonguard and Harrowstorm, as I've covered in prior tanking videos. So no new sets are reintroduced that really replaced any of the current tanking sets. No new Marsh Helm sets were really introduced. So not much has really been altered between the build from Dragonguard and the build that you're seeing today. So for those of you guys who have been following the guide from Dragonguard, that guide is pretty much still going to be correct. There are some minor changes here and there for this build, but for the most part, they're pretty much identical. So unlike like the rest of our build videos, we will not be going over any of the gear. That's covered in the tanking gear video, which will be popping up in the upper right hand corner right about now. So if you're interested in knowing what sort of gear you should be running, what sort of gear you should be having in your inventory as a tank, feel free to check out that video and then come back here. We will be covering skills and kind of talk about tanking in general, how Warden tanks differ from other tanks, and so on. Let's go ahead and get started here with our skills, starting off with our front bar, which is our sword and board bar. So our first ability is Pierce Armor. We already have a source of minor protection from our class abilities, so we might not necessarily need to run Ransack, which is the other morph of Puncture. That being said, you can run Ransack instead because you might not use the ability for minor protection. So having Ransack as a backup for the minor protection is always good to have on hand, but you can realistically go with either morph here of Puncture. Next we have Heroic Slash for the minor heroism and the minor maim. We have our Self Heal, which is Polar Wind. This does scale based off of our max health, so the more health we have, the better the heal is. In general, I believe it heals you for about 30% of your health right off the bat, and then it heals another 3% every 5 seconds, so it basically heals you for about 40 or 45% of your max health in total once you have the full 5 seconds complete. It also heals one other person for that same initial heal amount, so it's actually not that bad of a way to help proc Symphony as well, because it will try to heal somebody else as well. It also deals a little bit of frost damage as well, so it does act as a little bit of a DPS boost for you if you're kind of into that sort of thing. But this is a pretty strong self-heal here. Then we have two flex spots here. I have Gripping Shards and Frozen Device here. Gripping Shards is your hard CC, so it will immobilize enemies that are trapped within it. Now it is centered on yourself, so you basically need to run in and then cast it, so it's pretty much exactly like Talons. The radius is also 6 meters, so pretty good to have this here, and then on top of the immobilization, it also slightly snares them as well after the immobilization ends, so it is fairly useful to have on hand if you do need to, hard CC anything. Then we have Frozen Device, which is the Warden's version of Chain. Now this is a little bit more tricky to use because it does have a 1.5 second arm time, so it's not like you can immediately cast it and get somebody to immediately teleport to you. But if you can set it up appropriately, you can chain in a bunch of things altogether. Now, one of the cool things with Frozen Device is that it does afflict major maim on anything it pulls in. So for certain 4-man content, this might be very beneficial for ads that have very devastating attacks. For example, Black Rose Prison has a couple of ads that are chainable that deal quite a bit of damage, so inflicting major maim on them is actually pretty good. You can have also 3 portals out at a time, so if you are smart for things like Black Rose Prison or DSA, you could put them where you want, where you believe enemies are going to hit them, and then they'll get ported over. Now, you are still limited by the range, so if you put down a portal and then move further than 28 meters away, it will not pull the enemy more than 28 meters towards you. In fact, it will just proc and they'll just stay where they are. So just do keep that in mind if you are using Frozen Device as your chains option. And for ultimate, we have Arriving Barrier here. This gives us 10% up to 10% additional Magicka regen from the Magicka Aid passive under the support line under the Alliance War Tree. Then for our back bar, we have Inner Rage as our ranged taunt, Balance for our Major Resolve, as well as for our Magicka regen. Blockade of Storms to help proc off balance and our enchant on the back bar. You'd be running Blockade of Frost, obviously, with the Frost Staff, and Endless Hail as a bow back bar. Full Netch for our stamina return. It's also a self-cleanse, so you get one negative effect removed every 5 seconds, so you can spam it for just continuously remove effects. Then you have a flex spot here, and I have Shimmering Shield, but you have a bunch of abilities you could replace this with. So Shimmering Shield is useful if you know you're fighting against something that is using projectiles. So it absorbs quite a bit of damage from any sort of projectile, and it also gives you major heroism. So this is actually one of the most consistent ways to get major heroism in the game that's not constrained to a set or some other sort of weird niche passive. So Warden tanks can get incredibly high ultimate generation in fights where you're fighting against something that's using projectiles. So for example, Zamaja, you can get pretty good uptime on Warhorns just by using Shimmering Shield to eat her Nocturnal's favor. Lakestes, if you are fighting at ranged and you're using Shimmering Shield, you can get a lot of ultimate very quickly because you have that major heroism up for pretty much 100% of the time, 100% of the fight. So really powerful move here where you are able to proc the major heroism. Then we have Aggressive Warhorn for the major force. Now, in terms of other abilities to have on hand under the Animal's Companions line, Subterranean Assault or Deep Fissure. These are basically AoE sources of either Major Fracture or Major Breach respectively. So if you are in a mixed group, you gotta pick one or the other. You can't have both, obviously. But for single DPS type, so all stamina or all magicka, you could run one of these two to give AoE, Major Fracture, Major Breach in trash pulls, for example. Growing Swarm or Fetcher Infection for the minor vulnerability that it applies. Fetcher Infection might be the better option because it uses magicka versus stamina, but Growing Swarm is also a perfectly fine option as well. Deceptive Predator gives you a source of major expedition as well as minor evasion while you have it slotted, so that it helps reduce your damage you take from AoE attacks, which is always beneficial. There are plenty of moves in trials and in dungeons that count as AoE attacks, so having 10% additional mitigation is always helpful here. Then Cutting Dive and Screaming Cliff Racer, while you can set enemies off balance when you use them, you have to be more than 7 meters away, which usually will never be the case for a tank, so don't bother with these abilities here. I know some people are going to ask about it, that's why I'm mentioning it here. You need to be further than 7 meters away, which if you're doing that as a tank, the boss is going to be moving, so you don't want to have that happening. Under the green balance line, you could run Enchanted Forest as an ultimate. This is a burst heal. Not going to be quite as strong because obviously your weapon damage, your spell damage is not very high as a tank, but it's still possible to run this as a kind of emergency heal ultimate. It's just not a very strong one because, again, you're a tank. Other heals that you might want to consider having if you're running Symphony of Blades, for example, would be things like Budding Seeds for the heal over time, or Corrupting Pollen, whichever one you want to go for. Enchanted Growth is another good one, but it's a conal, so just be mindful of that. It might not necessarily hit everybody, depending on how far away they all are from you. Living Vines, either morph. Typically speaking, it will hit you because you will normally have the lowest health because, I mean, you're the tank, you're the one taking the most damage. But it does apply minor lifesteal, and it does essentially act as damage reduction because it heals you every time you take damage. It won't protect you from a one-shot, but it is still a potential option if you want to apply minor lifesteal to anything. There are other ways to get minor lifesteal, though, so this is not a very common ability to use. Lotus Blossom or Green Lotus, doesn't really matter which one you pick here, it's just another heal whenever you light attack. It's to you or another nearby ally, but it's not a very strong heal, so I don't usually recommend using this ability. Under the Winter's Embrace line, Ice Fortress will give everybody within 8 meters of you major resolve, as well as give you minor protection. So when I mentioned that you might not need to run Ransack because you have a source of minor protection, this is the ability that I'm thinking of. Now, the major resolve is probably not going to be beneficial because you would be getting this from running Balance, but if you don't want to run Balance, if you feel like your sustain is fine without running Balance, you could run Ice Fortress instead for the minor protection and the major resolve. And then everything else we've already covered here. Under the weapons line, defensive posture, either morph, absorb missile, or defensive stance could be beneficial depending on kind of what you want to have. Absorb missile is a heal when you get hit by a direct damage projectile. Could be useful, but Shimmering Shield is going to be better because it just absorbs more damage and it gives you major heroism. Same thing with defensive stance. It reflects the next direct damage projectile, which could be beneficial for Lakestes, for example. But again, you have Shimmering Shield, which eats up a lot more damage and gives you major heroism. So I personally don't find that I use Absorb Missile or Defensive Stance very often on a Warden because I would just use Shimmering Shield because, hey, major heroism. more Warhorns is definitely better. I would recommend picking up Shield Charge, at least learning the base ability, because there is a fight where you're going to need to use it, the triplets in VHOF, and there could be other fights that are introduced in the game later on where you're going to want a gap closer. So I would recommend at the very least having a skill point available to pick up the base ability of Shield Charge. If you want to morph it, go for the Shield Assault, because that gives you the damage shield, which fits more in line with the tank. Under the Destro staff line, consider getting Crushing Shock as a ranged interrupt. Bow line, that would be Venom Arrow for the ranged interrupt, so it's always nice to have that option to interrupt things at range. Under the armor line, the heavy armor ability Unstoppable, either morph, you could use this as an immunity to knock back and disabling effects for 6 seconds. So very, very good in those situations where you need that immunity there. It does end up producing a movement speed though, so just be mindful of that. You can still dodge roll, but if you're running something like Immovable, you won't be moving very far. I mean, that's why it's called Immovable. So just keep that in mind if you do decide to use this ability. It does use stamina, so just be mindful of your stamina pool if you are using this ability as well. Let's see here. Under the Fighter's Guild line, if you don't want to run Frozen Device because of the limitations that I talked about a little bit earlier, you can run Silver Leash. This is an immediate chain rather than having to wait the 2 seconds for the portal to arm, and you can target exactly what you want to pull in, but it uses stamina, so you just need to be mindful of your stamina pool if you're using Silver Leash. Ring of Preservation for minor protection and a small heal over time, good for additional mitigation. Let's see here, anything else? Under the Sigil Order line, you might want to consider picking up Meditate, either Morph, Introspection, or Deep Thoughts for some additional resource return. Now, the downside of running this ability is that it is a channel, so you won't be able to block while you are using this ability. You do have access to the Deliberation passive if you get high enough Sigil Order, in the high enough I don't know what it's called, rank in Sigil Order. It gives you major protection, which reduces damage by 30%, but that's not quite the same as 50% block mitigation. So just keep that in mind before you decide to use this ability here. Make sure to have everything unlocked under the Undaunted line here. So Overflowing Altar for Lifesteal and the Blood Feast synergy, Shadow Silk for the Black Widow synergy. The Black Widow synergy is still free damage even though it has been nerfed. Already talked about the ranged taunt. Bone Surge for the Spinal Surge synergy provides a damage shield and major vitality. You're mainly using it for the major vitality, which is beneficial in high healing scenarios like Baneful Mark and Execute for Cloud Rest. But beyond that, not going to be used very often. But where it is used, it's very beneficial. Energy Orb for the heal to help proc Symphony of Blades and to provide additional combustion synergies as well. Even as a tank, Energy Orb is actually a pretty decent heal, so you might want to run it anyways, even if you aren't using Symphony, just to help out your DPS and your healers. Under the Alliance War line, Echoing Vigor acts as a self-heal and an AoE heal to help proc Symphony of Blades. While Resolve and Vigor does give you more healing done per second, Echoing Vigor can stack on multiple instances of itself. So if you have multiple stamina DPS, you can all stack your Echoing Vigors together to get even more healing done per second, outstripping that of Resolving Vigor potentially. Under the support line, you already have a self-cleanse through Netch, but if you need to cleanse from other people in the group, you're going to want to run Efficient Purge here. And that pretty much covers it for all the skills you're going to want to have on hand as a Warden tank. Now about tanking in general. Tanks have basically 2 roles in ESO. First one is obviously to maintain taunt on the boss, be your typical damage sponge, but the second one is to buff your allies and debuff the enemies. Now some of this is going to be coming from your abilities, some of it's going to be coming from your sets. So for example, Yolnahkriin provides Minor Courage. That's a buff, but that is a set buff. If you're running something like Veteran Infection or Growing Swarm, that provides minor vulnerability on whatever it is you hit, and that's a debuff, so you want to make sure to manage that. Associated with debuffs would be things like maintaining Blockade or Endless Hail in order to keep that Crusher Enchant going on your back bar, or Shock Damage Enchant to help proc off balance. Blockade of Storms helps proc off balance, so other ways to kind of make sure to have stuff down, that way you can maintain good uptimes on your debuffs and buffs. Warden tanking in general, you don't have any damage shields outside of Shimmering Shield, but that only counts for projectiles. So you don't have, for example, something an analogous sort of Igneous Shield, for example, or a Blazing Shield. You basically have instead a fairly strong burst heal, self-heal. Polar Wind is actually pretty decently strong. And again, it is about more or less about a 30% burst heal right off the bat. And plus you get a little bit more, about 3% or so, every second for 5 seconds, for a total of about half of your health, a little bit less than half your health overall, before you count things like CP or major mending or vitalities or things like that. So it can be a very strong burst heal. So Warden tanks in general, they are pretty decent when it comes to mitigation. You do have several sources of mitigation. You have a source amount of protection where you don't necessarily need to use something like Temporal Guard or Ransack to get it. But in terms of healing, they're generally speaking going to be a little bit better in terms of healing compared to some other classes, outside of maybe the Dragon Knight. That's mainly because Wardens also have a source of major mending, which is basically unique to Wardens if you're not running any sort of like weird sets or anything. So your heals are going to be a little bit stronger heal compared to some other classes. Again, with the exception possibly being DKs with Green Dragon Blood. Warden tanks can be a little bit clunky when it comes to kind of chaining things in if you're using Frozen Device, just because of that sort of arm time associated with it. But Warden tanks in general are pretty decent. One of their biggest strengths are in fights with projectiles, because you can get major heroism and get some wicked ultimate generation going here. So definitely a solid tanking class. You'll commonly see Warden tanks being used as off tanks or just main tanks in general for a lot of Trials guilds because of their very well balanced toolkit. They have a good sort of balance between mitigation, self heals, and overall group utility as well. So pretty nice tanking class to go along with. It's easier to kind of explain tanking and support roles in general by actually watching videos of people tanking. I do have a Warden that can double as a tank. Currently it's spec'd as a magical Warden, but it can be played as a tank as well. And I do have a couple of older streams on my channel where I did play that Warden tank. So you can definitely check out the Streams Archives playlist to kind of find the Warden tank videos. Not much has changed in playstyle for tanking throughout the various patches that have come through. So a tanking video, a Warden tanking video from 2 or 3 patches ago should still be a good learning material, good learning guide for Warden tanking and tanking in general. You can also, of course, take a look at DK tanking videos. The core concepts behind tanking don't change too much between different classes. It's just sort of abilities. So you could take a DK tanking video and sort of adapt that to Wardens as well. But that concludes this video. If you guys have any questions at all about Warden tanking or tanking in general, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. I'll try to answer your questions to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.